The disturbing state of the UK's prisons has been in the news this week, after the government was forced to take control of a Birmingham prison from a private company. The move has led many to point the finger of blame at privatisation. But Will Heaven, Director of Policy at the Policy Exchange think tank, argues in this week's magazine that this conclusion misses the point. Unfortunately, public and private prisons are equally as bad, and a prison's age is a better indicator of its quality. Will joins me now, along with Cody Lachey, a former prisoner at Manchester Strangeways, and now a prison reform campaigner. Will, in your article, you write about your experience of going into a prison for the first time when you were working for the government. What was that like? Were you surprised by what you saw?
I was surprised. I joined the Ministry of Justice 2 years ago as Michael Gove's speechwriter, and I'd never been to a prison before. And I think what I was struck by the most in my first few weeks, I was given a kind of whistle-stop tour of a few prisons, was that the only ones that seemed to function well were in the category A. So they were basically the high security prisons. But the other ones, the category Bs, Wandsworth, Pentonville, those sorts of places, were in complete chaos.
Cody, this week, as we know, reports came out that Birmingham's Winston Green prison had blood and vomit on the floors, guards locking themselves in offices for fear of attacks, and drugs being openly taken. Did this come as any surprise to you, given your time in prison?
No, absolutely not. The first aim and the last goal for a private prison is financial gain. And that comes at the cost of officers, security, conditions, treatment, food, everything. And it has a domino effect onto the regime and everything else. So prison officers are outnumbered. I think they've got low morale, and prisoners and criminals that are acting within the prison system reference drugs and bullying and intimidation, all that sort of stuff, are obviously going to prosper in that environment. But it doesn't surprise me, both public prisons and private prisons are performing as well, or should I say as badly, as each other.
Well, why are these experiences so common?
I think one of the most striking things is that most of the worst prisons in the country, the ones that are causing the government serious concern, are generally the oldest ones, and that is a big problem in the system. So a huge number of our prisons were built in the Victorian era. They are now basically dilapidated, in serious need of repair, or I would argue actually closure. And I think what you need is a bit more investment in the sort of prison estate that you'd expect to find in a 21st century country, because some of the findings, some of the stuff in the letter from Peter Clark, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, was just absolutely extraordinary, the sort of things he was noting, and you would not expect it. We really shouldn't expect to find that in Britain today.
And one of the themes we've heard a lot this week, and Cody's touched on it, is the idea of privatisation and the fact that it's G4S that ran this prison. In your piece, you suggest that it's not as simple as that. Do you think it plays any role in the problems? Well,
again, of the 15 prisons that are causing the government most concern, Birmingham is the only one that is privately run. Now, obviously, critics of privatisation would say, yes, but all the other prisons will have some form of outsourcing. For example, Liverpool Prison is in a complete state and got an awful report at the end of last year, but their maintenance is run by an outside firm. So people would point to that as the reason. But I would generally say that investment is needed in both public and state prisons.
Cody, one of the things that Will mentions in his piece as one of the problems is the inexperience of prison guards and the rise in the number of new prison guards. Did you, during your time in prison, notice a difference between experienced guards and new guards?
Yeah, absolutely. As Will alluded to in his piece, the MOJ were throwing out this, we're actively recruiting 2,500 officers. They recruited 3,111 ahead of schedule. But I did an interview with the POA, the Prison Officers Association National Chair, Mark Fairhurst, and he said himself, for the 3,111 new prison officers they've gained, they've lost over 7,000 experienced officers. Now, the fact is, as Will alluded to, again, I'm going back to Will's statement, and it's a very, very true statement, one old, former, experienced officer is worth 4. I'd go above 4 new officers, because the thing is with these officers, they're young, they're inexperienced, they've got no life experience. Old officers they know how to talk you down, and they've got, not in every regard, but in many regards, experienced officers have got that. They can pick up on the tension in the air. The man management skills were better. That experience plays a crucial role in keeping the security of the wing intact. But again, they're outnumbered, they're leaving the job. Staff retention is a huge problem. And you've got these young officers coming in with no life experience, putting them on very volatile wings with very volatile prisoners, with drugs, contraband. Where you've got contraband, you've got fear, intimidation, bullying and violence. Mental health plays a significant part. And you've got these young officers that they're being manipulated, so they're retreating to the office. Like Peter Clark, the Chief Inspector, the Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons, said himself, prisoner officers were locking themselves in the office. So it's a huge problem, and it's going to continue that way, unfortunately.
On that note, Cody, what reforms do you think are needed to make the system better?
They need to abolish short sentences. They need the court system should have more faith in community orders, community payback orders, other punishments. That I've been in prison with people for murder. I've been in prison with people that haven't paid parking fines. I've been in prison with people that haven't paid council tax. Short sentences, you don't get any sentencing plan. If anything, you're just left to rot in prison. I've been in short sentences in prison, and there's no help. You just a waste of the taxpayers' money. They need to. Rather than making prisons out of our students, we should be making students out of our prisoners. The sole aim of a prison should be rehabilitation. And rather than they're putting money into resources around prisons, the £10 million for the 10 worst performing prisons, right, is being spent £6 million on security and like detection, drug detection, things like that. £3 million on repairs and £1 million for staff. They should be injecting the money into prisoners. They should be turning prisons into places of skills training, education, resettlement and reintegration, so reform can actually take place. Because as it stands now, rehabilitation is a made-up word, so people like the Justice Secretary David Gauke, Michael Spur, who's the Chief Executive of Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, and Rory Stewart, the Prisons Minister, can wear suits whilst getting paid £140,000 plus a year, and it's ridiculous. They're saying the right sort of things, but Rory Stewart said himself just the other day on an interview, judge me on my results, and if I do not reduce violence and drugs within prison within 12 months, I'll fall on my sword. So unfortunately, he's going to be out of a job within 12 months, and we'll have another prisons minister, and we'll have to start all over again.
Though it's worth noting, Rory Stewart hasn't actually put Birmingham on his list of prisons that he has to improve.
Obviously Lindholme, Ranby, Nottingham, Wealdstone. The thing is, though, if you look at Birmingham Prison, right, Peter Clark said it's some of the worst prison conditions he's ever seen. That Birmingham prison isn't even in the bottom 10. So what does that say about the state of those 10 prisons at the bottom of the heap?
So, Will, is this simply a case of investing more money? You touch on something in your piece called jailcraft.
So jailcraft is basically knowing how to behave on the landings, so how prison officers should deal with prisoners. And I think experience is a massive factor. I remember meeting a prison governor who had decades of experience on the landings, and he showed me the sort of scars on his neck and face from various incidents, various scrapes that he'd been in over the years. And basically he'd worked his way up to being a prison governor. He knew how to deal with people. The problem, as Cody mentions, is actually that there are so many people on short sentences that they're in and out of jail for weeks at a time. So what you have is a churn. You have prison officers who don't stay for very long or who are very new, and then you have prisoners who are only in for weeks at a time, and nothing settles down. If you imagine being a prisoner, and I'm sure Cody could tell us more about this, arriving in prison on your first day, your immediate thought is going to be, what's the pecking order here? How do I prove myself? Who's in control? And if the population is churning over every few weeks, it actually just means there's a constant battle for control. It's the law of the jungle, essentially.
Now, one of the things you suggest in your piece, Will, is the idea of building new prisons, because certain prisons are now very old structurally, and that is a big factor. And if the government were to do that, it would obviously involve money. Given that we're constantly told government budgets have to be squeezed, still trying to find money for the government's NHS pledge, do you think this would be a popular pledge with the public?
Absolutely not. And that is part of the problem, that basically there isn't a massive public appetite for prisons. You know, when you talk about rats and cockroaches sort of infesting the cells, I can't believe your average punter cares about it. But I think it's basically a question of priorities. Do we, as, an advanced economy, a 21st century democracy, think that people we're incarcerating should live in those sorts of conditions? And ultimately, I think prison should be about punishment, yes, but also about rehabilitation, about turning an offender, someone who's committed crimes, into a law-abiding citizen, and squalor and violence and all the rest of it are not going to do that.
Cody, finally, do you think that actually part of the reason the prisons are in the state they are, I mean, we can blame the government in some ways, how they have run them, but it's partly down to public apathy at the system and how much money should go to them?
Prisoners are not on the government's agenda in many regards. I mean, prisons are underfunded and under-resourced, and they have been for a very long time. It's going to take decades, in my opinion, over a decade, to sort out the problems in place and everything. And like I say, like Will alluded to there, like squalid conditions, housing prisoners in inhumane, squalid conditions reminiscent of Dickensian England doesn't aid rehabilitation in any which way. It succeeds, and it succeeds in making you demoralised, desensitised, dehumanised, and even more disenfranchised than when you entered. Prison creates monsters in those circumstances. And the fact is, reoffending rates cost the taxpayer £15 billion a year. The Ministry of Justice, people like Rory Stewart, people like David Gork, right? They can't relate to the people they're residing over in the sense of prisoners, right? And that's the problem. The money management of the MOJ, I think, is really poor. They're saying all the right things, but talk is cheap. Prison can't be both punishment and rehabilitation. The punishment measure of prison, the punitive measure of prison, is losing your liberty. Once we get over that, prisons need to be places of skills training, education across the board, making these prisoners feel like they have a sense in society. Because you've got to remember, 99% of prisoners, right, are going to be released back into society at some point. It's the way we treat them and the conditions that they live in whilst in prison which will dictate and determine what happens to them upon release. And all these people on the right side of the tracks that want to brutalise prisoners, they shouldn't then be moaning if they become a victim of crime down the line by an offender that's left prison and goes on to reoffend.
Final question. You've spent time in prison and obviously you're not a reoffender. Do you think prison worked for you?
No, prison didn't work for me in any which way. I made more criminal connections in prison than I could have ever have wished to on the outside. I was involved in serious organised crime. I went to prison 3 times, right? The only thing on my last stretch that prison didn't rehabilitate me. I wasn't sick of going through that mire. What it was on my last stretch, right, I saw the effect my criminality was having on my mother. I'm not a mummy's boy, but I spoke to her partner at the time, and he was like, oh, she's not sleeping, she's not eating, she's got angina, which is a heart problem. She doesn't do motorway. She's travelling 2.5 hours to come on a visit. An hour on the visit, 2.5 hours back. She's sending you £50 a week. The woman's on minimum wage. She came on the visit, and for some reason, I had a light bulb moment. I saw it. I saw the effect my criminality was having on my mum. And I came out of prison, and I made her a promise, and I said to her, I will never, ever put you through what I put you through on the other 2 stretches. I said, I promise you, that is it. I came out of prison. I cut all my criminal ties. I now speak. I do interviews with the media. I speak at universities. And the fact is, I just opened my eyes to the effect my criminality was having. I went back to my cell. I cried my eyes out. I'd been a selfish person, and I could have very easily gone back to prison again and again. The fact is, with fewer police on the streets since 1996, since comparable records began, you make these criminal connections in prison. You might be in prison with someone for fraud, and they're like, listen, you get out, right? Listen, my mate's there. He's got a load of stolen credit card details. Hit him up and stuff, and because you've got to make money when you get out. You kicked out with £46, right? And I nearly lost my accommodation, right? On my last stretch, I was doing an 8-month sentence. I did 4 months, right? It would have been better served in the community, right? Like litter picking or working in a charity shop or painting fences or something like that. That would have been a productive punishment. Throwing me in prison, all it meant is that I was looking down the barrel of being homeless. I would have gone back into criminality, not through a want of having to, but to survive and to make money, to feed myself. I look at Norway, even the Scottish prison service, where justice has been devolved. They're showing us how it's done. In Holland, I think, or Sweden and Norway, they're closing prisons down because they don't have the amount of prisoners to actually go into the prison. I heard about Sweden apparently had prisoners shipped in so that they could house them because they haven't got the numbers. We live in one of the most developed countries in the world, and the way that prisoners, apart from since the Victorian times, in my opinion, since 1990, where the Strangeways riots happened, apart from in-cell sanitation being brought in and televisions, It's gone right the other way. We're going back to the Victorian times. Prisoners sharing the cells with mice, rats, and bloody cockroaches. And this is a developed country. It's laughable. And like I say, those on the right side of the tracks just look down the nose at us and want to brutalise prisoners. Brutalising prisoners creates monsters. It doesn't aid rehabilitation in any which way.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you, Will.